Welcome, everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges as he explores turning the page on his life and yours. Hey, Charlie.
Hey, Paul. Today's guest, Judge Mary Beth O'Connor, has recently released her new book, catch this, From Junkie to Judge, where she offers not only hope, but tactics to create your own robust recovery program. Mary Beth O'Connor has been sober since 1994. She has been in recovery from abuse, trauma, and anxiety. But 6 years into her recovery, Mary Beth attended Berkeley Law School. She worked at a large law firm, then litigated class actions for the federal government. In 2014, Mary Beth was appointed a federal administrative law judge, a position she held until 2020. Mary Beth is serious about sobriety and helping others recover from addictive substance abuse. She is director and founding investor for She Recovers Foundation and a director for LifeRing Secular Recovery. She speaks regularly about multiple paths to recovery, and I can't wait to talk to her about that. And one thing that's going to be interesting is Mary Beth has a Wall Street Journal op-ed about I Beat Addiction Without God. It's where she describes how to combine ideas from several secular programs to create a robust recovery foundation. This show will be fun. So let's bring Judge Mary Beth O'Connor onto the show. Mary Beth, welcome to the next chapter with Charlie.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to it.
Good, as am I. So today is going to be, in our pre-call, today is going to be very interesting because one of the subjects we will discuss is your successful experience of beating addiction without God. No higher power element in your story. Now, as my listeners know, I'm a strong believer in the interventions of God, so I really look forward to discovering even more about your secular-based interventions. I'm an open person, and I kind of can't wait to talk about your take on that.
Good. And I'm open, too, to the faith-based approach when it's right for the person. I mean, a lot of people succeed that way, but it wasn't right for me, and it's not right for many, and I just want everyone to know their options so they can have the best chance of succeeding.
I like that. Now, Mary Beth, before we get into recovery, which we will talk a lot about recovery, I think our listeners would profit greatly by hearing your personal story of debilitating addiction, recovery, and then finally a wonderful success in life. Do you think you could talk to me a bit about your story?
So for me, there's a common thread through it, which is that trauma led to substance use, right? And so I was raised by a mother who wasn't really bonded to me or connected to me, and she could be violent at times. But the bigger issue arose when she married my stepfather when I was 9, and he was very violent with her. He was physically and sexually violent with me, and it was just a household where you never knew what was going to happen, where I had little control over my physical being, over whether I was safe or not safe or what might trigger him. It was very unpredictable, and it was just a lot of stress and strain. And so when I found my first drug, which was alcohol, when I was 12, that was just a real mood lifter. I noticed, I took a deep breath. I was giggling with my girlfriend. I was having fun in a different way than I had experienced as far back as I could remember. And that captured my attention. And I wanted to repeat that experience. And so I started pursuing alcohol. I did not wait for it to come to me. I found ways to make it happen. And I moved on pretty fast, pot, pills, acid, a lot of acid my sophomore year of high school. And I found my drug of choice, which was meth, when I was 16. And I was shooting up at 17 years old and in full-bore addiction in high school.
Also, you talked to me about you were fully addicted, but you were also rather successful in high school, were you not?
Yeah, I mean, school had always been my one happy and safe place. I always did really well. I got a lot of positive and, unique, focused attention from teachers, which I didn't get anywhere else. And so school was always a place where I felt happier. And I did do well through high school. By the time I was shooting meth, it was really started the summer between my junior and senior year of high school. And so by the time it was really bad, the grades that I needed to go to college, the grades they were going to look at, those classes had already happened. And so by the time I started missing a lot of school and my grades dropped a bit, I had already been accepted. Plus, I had done so well that, I would go to the teacher and say I missed the test, there was family problems, and they would let me make up the work because of my track record. And so that's how I, was able to finish high school in pretty good standing.
So your high school experience was largely filled. I mean, I can't imagine how you could be addicted to methamphetamines and do well in school at the same time. You were a driven person, obvious to me.
Yeah, although, then when I went to college, I actually didn't do that much meth for the first couple years, which helped me to still continue to do well academically. And I even worked half-time because my family, didn't have money to help me. So I was still using a lot of alcohol. There was still a lot of chaos and crazy situations, and sometimes I used pills and sometimes cocaine, which was new to me, but mostly on the weekends and occasionally during the week. And so for the first 3.5 years of college, I was using excessively, but I wasn't really using meth. And then in January of my senior year, I picked meth up again because I had had this really life-threatening multi-assailant rape in college, and I moved in with a violent boyfriend after that, and I just couldn't hold it together anymore. And I picked meth up again in that January. And the next 10 years were not productive. I worked my way down the corporate ladder. Just couldn't hold a job, So every job was less money and less responsibility, and I held it for less time. And I kept going with speed until I was 32 years old. So it was a long haul. I did drugs for 20 years, and I did speed basically for 14 or 15 of those years.
Serious? You did drugs for 20 years. That's a long time to recover from. Your recovery is a remarkable statement of the process you used, the resilience and the empowerment you learned. Can't wait to talk about your process because 20 years is a long time in the face of addiction. As a matter of fact, very few people live 20 years that are addicted to dangerous drugs like that.
Yeah, and part of living was pure luck, but I also did do things like I used the needle exchange, which they had in San Francisco. It started in the late 80s because of HIV, and so when I got sober, I actually didn't have HIV, I didn't have hepatitis C or any blood-borne diseases, and that was partially luck and partially because I had access to clean needles.
I have a question that I want to go right to, but I had another one in between, and so let's see if this works. Let me do my in-between question. Because I want to talk about the relationship between trauma and substance abuse. What led you to write this important book, From Junkie to Judge?
So when I was appointed a federal judge, it was sort of a natural time of reflection, like, how the heck did I do this? I was shooting meth at 17 and now I'm a judge. And so I started taking notes, thinking about, well, maybe there's a story here, maybe it would be of use, right, of value. And part of what I was thinking about was the fact that my having been a judge, but also having shot meth might help reduce stigma if I was open about that. I do feel like there's sort of a hierarchy of addiction in America, that it's better to be addicted to alcohol than to meth. It's better to pop pills than to shoot up. And I shot meth, which is sort of at the lower end of that spectrum. And I also thought about the fact that I did do it the secular way, and that's most of the memoirs that are about recovery are 12-step memoirs. And they're very useful for people, but I thought that having done it another way, it would be a good example or a good reassurance for people who want to do it with a secular approach, that actually it's an equally viable path, and sort of here's how I did it, here was my thought process, here's some things to think about to build your own solid foundation.
I totally understand the secular viewpoint, and especially when you told me what you focus on. What was your initial response when you started attending 12-step groups and they said you have to admit that you are powerless against this and that you can only depend upon a higher power to get yourself in a recovery process, and you could not adopt that. What was the roadblock there?
Well, I mean, first, I do want to say there are actually a lot of people of faith in the secular programs because they don't like other aspects of 12 steps. So it's not just atheists and agnostics, for example, that do secular. People of faith or spiritual beliefs do it as well for other reasons. But for me, I don't believe in a higher power, but also it's that turn your will and your life over. I wasn't going to do that, and I didn't agree I was powerless, and I also didn't like to focus on defects, so I had a lot of problems. But the real danger that they put me in was, it wasn't just people at 12-step meetings. My rehab told me that the 12-step way was the one and only way. I mean, they were adamant that there were no other options, and that actually put my recovery at risk, because what if I would have believed them when I can't do that? Why try, right? Why try if it's going to be impossible? But luckily I thought about it, and I thought, could it really be true that no atheist in the history of the world
has ever been sober?
It did not seem likely. It didn't seem likely. But it was a dilemma, and it really made me have to stand back and sort of take control of my recovery and decide what to do. And so, I mean, I did read all of the AA Big Book. I read all of the NA text. I was really actively participating in rehab, and I was in a long-term program. I was in for 5 months. So I was reading everything to find the part.
In a long-term AA program or inpatient?
In inpatient. I was inpatient. It was a women's program, and it was a minimum of 90 days, so it was long-term, and I ended up staying for 5 months. And so...
Good for you.
Yeah, so, I mean, I didn't just, say, throw it all out. I went through it to try to find the parts I thought I could use, and there were parts that I found useful. I mean, one day at a time, I found that to be really useful. When I was struggling with cravings, I'd say, well, I'm not deciding for tomorrow. For today, my plan is not to use. And I looked at the steps. I went through all of them to think about, is there a core idea here that I could use? Like that powerless idea. I didn't agree I was powerless, but what I thought about it, and I said, well, you know what? I can agree. I'm powerless to moderate. There's no moderating for me, So I went through all of it to try to find parts that I could use and apply.
Yeah, there's kind of a famous but unknown, can't remember the woman's name, but wrote a book, Moderate Drinking, that you could go from an addictive alcoholic to drinking moderately. And as I heard the story, she ended up wrapping her car around a tree. That she used no recovery process. She just thought she would moderate her drinking. And we as addicts and alcoholics know you can't do that. And I think perhaps now might be a good opportunity just to remind our listeners that I too am an alcoholic and drug abuser from a long time ago. Before your time, it was in the 70s, and that was during my decade of the 20s. In 26 years, I've been sober 12 years twice, with 2 years in between. And so I understand the addictive process and the substance abuse process and the recovery process as well. So we're talking kind of a bit on the same page of understanding the process involved.
Yes.
I have just so many questions for you. I want to go to this last one. We had a podcast, I believe 2 weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, that was Dr. Randall Bell, and it was on post-traumatic thriving, and it got a lot of response. And I think there is something going on in our culture today, especially with the rise of PTSD, but then starting to look at trauma not just in that radical sense of PTSD, but that there are traumatic experiences, especially from childhood, that impact us very directly throughout our lives. And unless we deal with that, we're working out of a hole. Talk to me about the relationship between trauma and substance abuse.
I mean, I heard a couple things there, and one is, I'll say, I had a variety of types of trauma. I was raped more than once. I grew up, with physical abuse, sexual abuse. But to your point that there's other kinds of trauma, one of my traumas one of my sort of vulnerabilities was because my mother's lack of connection to me, right? So it is broader than just the big traumatic events that can have those kind of long-term impacts on us. But there is strong data that shows that if someone has a traumatic childhood, especially if it's ongoing and not like a one-time, incident, my odds of developing a substance use disorder were around 4 to 6 times higher than the general population. Or the flip side to that is that 75 to 80% of people that develop a substance use disorder have a trauma history. So there's a really strong connection. And for me, I always knew that it was related. I just didn't know how to resolve it. And the trick, as you know, with the drugs, including alcohol. When I say drugs, I always mean including alcohol. Okay?
Of course, I do too.
It's the most popular drug, right? But
right.
I knew there was that connection. But the drugs at first seemed to help with dealing with the trauma. That's how they get you, right? They seem to help, but then it turned into my number one problem. And I tried when I was still using to deal with my trauma. Several times I tried therapy, but the drugs were a wall between me and myself. So I could never make any progress. I couldn't get to my feelings. I couldn't even really accurately understand my own history until I got sober. But yeah, it's much more common to develop a substance use disorder if you have a trauma history or other serious dysfunctions in your family.
I've never heard that statistic that 75% of people in substance abuse have experienced some kind of trauma, most likely in childhood, but it could be in adolescence. That's a very, very tumultuous time. Not necessarily one traumatic event, but a history of trauma where it is, we take it as our personality, as AA will say, as a character defect. We'll take that as a character defect when it's really been pushed on us by somebody else.
Well, the other side of the children, even if it's one event, if they don't get proper help, I mean, in a way, that's sort of a reinforcing the trauma, right? I mean, one of the ways we could reduce the substance use rate in America, which, by the way, is very high, when you compare it to other countries, is getting proper mental health intervention to children and teenagers when they need it. That would actually be the number one way to reduce substance use in this country.
I agree. If therapy was involved, it would be even more helpful. But so frequently we just have drug dispensaries. That does help, but that is not going to alleviate the core problem until you can talk about it, understand it, deal with it, face it, and understand that broken inner child doesn't have to be you today.
That's true. I mean, sometimes the medicine is because that's what insurance likes to pay for, right? They don't like to pay for real treatment. And I was on medication for a while. When I got sober, I mean, I had PTSD and I didn't know it. I had severe anxiety, and I just thought I was high-strung,
Right, right.
And I was on medication for anxiety for a couple of years, and it did help me, but I was also in therapy, at the same time. And eventually I was able to get off of the medication. But yeah, if we had earlier intervention in these types of issues, it would help avoid people's sort of emotional need to turn to substances.
I so agree. I'm in therapy and on medications for depression and anxiety, and the medications have been wonderful. Mary Beth, I bet it's been 2 years since I've had a depressive episode. Anxiety jumps up every now and then, but it has been the therapy alongside of it. I'm with not a psychologist, but a psychiatrist who happens to be a brilliant therapist at the same time. So it's very, very helpful. I completely agree with your observation there. Give us an idea. We're using, we get using words that are familiar to you and I, and familiar at the highest level with our listeners, but apart from rape and physical abuse and war, can you give me just a list of traumas that people may identify with and never even thought, man, that was a trauma in my life, and I never even thought it was traumatic?
Well, there's the Adverse Childhood Experiences list, which people can look up. It's a series of 10 questions, and I know one of them involves poverty, right? Poverty is a type of trauma. Well, and I don't think it's on the ACE list, but I don't think people appreciate that even watching violence is a trauma on a child. So even if my stepfather had never been violent with me, watching him abuse my mother, that's a whole separate trauma in and of itself. But there can also be, cultural trauma, right? If you're in an environment where your community isn't being treated in a fair way, that creates trauma. It creates anxiety and stress that we don't always appreciate. A parent going to jail or prison can be a trauma. Being separated from either parent for any reason is a type of trauma. Moving a lot can be challenging for kids. Bullying, that could be a trauma as well, that people might not always understand the full weight of how it hit them. Kids can really be impacted simply by being isolated, not having friends, right? I mean, for a child, not being able to socialize and have close friendships is a form of stressor, right? It's a stressor that can create a vulnerability. So I think of things like that.
You know what I think, Mary Beth? I think you ought to write a book on this. That is so good. That is the best description of trauma I have ever heard. It is so broad, and it shows us. And areas came back to my mind that when the 1 year I lived with my father between 6 and 7.5, and my father drank a quart of liquor a day and had a tendency at times to be abusive, not so much to me, but to his wife, not my mother, but his wife at the time, and how uncomfortable that was. Uncomfortable is not even the right word. There is sort of a shock. There is a trauma involved in watching somebody else get beat up by somebody who is much stronger, much bigger, and much more angry. And I also she called the police on him, and the police came to the house to arrest him. I was 6 years old, in my sixth year. They came to arrest him, and I was fighting the police to keep from taking my dad to jail, and they scared me, said, "You want to go with him?" And I decided to calm down. I've never even looked at that, Mary Beth, as trauma, and yet that was a rather traumatic experience.
Yes, it was. It was a traumatic experience. And if he was repeatedly being violent with her, it's also that you don't know when it's going to happen, right? So it's that stress and strain. If she says something that's wrong, you freeze in your tracks to see how's he going to react, all those kind of impacts.
Oh, my goodness. Yes. I have a question about something when you're talking about the escalation of substances. Now, I don't believe so much in what kind of drugs do they call them, where one drug leads to the next drug? Gateway drugs. See, I don't believe pot leads to other drugs necessarily. It can, but I'm not a big believer in that. Because I know too many people that smoke pot and that's all they do, and that's all they're ever going to do. They're not going to do more than that.
Right.
But there is something you mentioned that I think is very, very important. And that in the beginning, especially at younger age, in our teens and in our college years, you and I agree that drinking and drugs most definitely start out as fun. We do them because they are fun. But they don't stay that way, do they?
No. I mean, they do for people who use them in moderation, perhaps, but they don't when you use them to excess. And it turned on me quickly. I was making poor judgment decisions before I ever picked up meth. Drinking too much, being in vulnerable positions, or just, waking up the next day and being hungover, or getting in the car with people who were too drunk and shouldn't have been driving. I mean, all those things just from the alcohol before I even picked up meth. Meth was just the next strongest thing. But yeah, it's no drug. We don't talk about gateway drugs anymore. It's, as I'm sure you know, it's sort of old terminology because. Oh,
is it? No, I'm not familiar. It's been a long time since I've been to a meeting. So
part of the reason is because we now focus on the newer definition of substance use disorder or addiction is about negative consequences. It's not. Remember the old way we used to think, how many drinks did you have in a week or a day, and those things still count for what is considered moderate drinking, but the real focus is around what are the negative consequences of whatever substance you're using. How's it impacting your life? And so Gateway sort of suggests that any drug use is negative, whereas, as you say, most people use alcohol and cannabis and even other drugs in moderation. And so it's not about the drug itself. It's about how the drug is used. How do you use the drug? What are the consequences in your life? That's sort of the determiner about whether it's problematic use or not.
You know the way I used it. I have a feeling I'm not alone, that there are other people that do this. Especially with alcohol. I did not, in my later years, in my 50s even, I did not drink to get high. I drank to get normal.
Yeah.
Because drinking sort of settled the demons, settled the voices, calmed them down to where I just felt normal. I didn't feel judged. Anxiety was released. And so if I just had 2 glasses of wine, I'd be brilliant. My life would be brilliant with 2 glasses of wine a day, and I would not consider myself an alcoholic. But I'm one of those ones that 1 is too many and 20 isn't enough. If 2 makes me feel this way, imagine what 3 would make me feel like. That became my drug, is trying to stay normal, trying to avoid, boy, you've really got me thinking on trauma, trying to avoid the trauma and all of the anxiety and all the judgments. It was an avoidance process.
Well, I think that's what society in general underappreciates. Addiction is miserable, right? It's not fun. The fun party days are long gone, and it's a horrible, chaotic, confusing in a way life experience. Things are always going wrong. You don't really fully comprehend why they're going wrong or how much it has to do with your own behavior, and it's just miserable. I remember looking in the mirror sometimes saying, you're poisoning yourself, and I just kept doing it. I felt stuck and trapped until I finally was able to find a way out of it. But yeah, it's not, as you know, it's not fun. It's an existence I wouldn't wish on anyone.
I am so excited about what you have to say. I want to take a break, and what I want to do is I want to move on to, we've sort of illustrated the issues. You have real clear ideas about recovery processes, and I would like to take a break and then come back and spend the last half of our show talking about recovery. Is that okay with you?
Sure, perfect.
Okay, great. Hi there, you're listening to The Next Chapter with Charlie Hedges, and this is Charlie, and I am in a fascinating discussion. I'm having a fascinating discussion with Judge Mary Beth O'Connor, who had several years in the depths of substance and addictive behaviors, substance abuse and addictive behaviors, went through recovery, and after going through recovery, went to law school and was appointed a federal judge. And she has a tremendous success story. But the fascinating thing about Mary Beth is we are not going to down talk AA and 12 steps. That there is a place for AA and 12 steps, and they're doing a wonderful job. I recommend people to go there. There's so much sobriety that has happened as a result of that program. But Mary Beth is going to give us ideas of other interventions, other recovery programs that may not be so faith-based, but are holistic and whole life-based, and I just can't wait to get into that. So, Mary Beth, let's start with this. I know we already talked about it, but let's just briefly, as a beginning to this, talk about what does secular recovery, how does it look different than the AA powerless without God approach?
So there are a number of different secular programs which we can talk about, and I'm sure we will, and they have somewhat different philosophies, and they often have different meeting formats, but some of the basic ideas are really about self-empowerment. So LifeRing, for example, I'm on the board for LifeRing Secular Recovery, and we called ours the 3S philosophy. So it's sobriety, which actually includes medication-assisted treatment. We count that as sober. If someone's taking medication for alcohol use disorder or opioid use disorder, as prescribed, that's sober. And then secularity is out of respect for all faiths and none. There's no religion in the meetings, but many members have personal religious or spiritual beliefs, and that LifeRing has no opinion about that. But the real key, third S is self-empowerment. So LifeRing teaches that you actually are not powerless, but you need to fight for your recovery, and that your success is going to be mostly based on your own efforts. And we also talk about that each person's plan, their recovery plan, is going to be different because, I'm not the same as you, and Sally's not the same as me, and our plan is going to look different for that reason. So it's about building a plan that works for me by doing an analysis about what are some of the tools that are available, what are sort of the goals that I have, what are my specific plans, and then using the group as a source of support, but also as a source of ideas. So in a LifeRing meeting, members actually talk directly to each other. I could say to the group, this situation is coming up next week. Does anybody have any suggestions? And that's what they are, suggestions for me to consider to see if they'll work for me. So those are some of the key ideas.
I like that. AA tends to be, and I have such respect for AA, but at times it tends to be very prescriptive. In that, in the 12 steps, we follow the 12 steps, and there are a plethora of steps in between the 12 steps. So it's rather prescriptive. Do this, do this, do this. There's not a lot of open end. Let me try to discover more about myself and discover even my strengths and my talents, and how I can use my talents, my gifts, my strengths, how I can use those to prepare me better for recovery.
Right. I mean, so for example, the LifeRing, we actually have a workbook to help people build their plan, but it's not answers. It's a lot of questions and fill in the blanks and checklists. It's to help people think it through. And the other side of what you said, I'm thinking about Women for Sobriety, which is the first modern secular option and was the first secular group I had. In a Women for Sobriety meeting, what the focus is on building up your competence and your confidence. And so in a Women WFS meeting, the introduction is actually not I'm Mary Beth and I'm an addict. It's I'm Mary Beth and I'm a competent woman. That's the identifier, because they're trying to help you build up your competency and your confidence and your capabilities. And that's the focus of a lot of the self-empowerment viewpoint. That's underneath a lot of the self-empowerment approaches.
And it's so much in line with my life philosophy that we are created with so many internal gifts and talents. And when we are told that you have no power, we can't tap into that. I love the idea of empowerment. I love the idea. I've never liked, gosh, I'm going to sound like I'm bashing AA, and forgive me, AA people, because I am not. I will still recommend people go to AA and discover what they can, because so much sobriety happens out of that. But I never liked saying, my name is Charlie, I'm an addict. I wanted to say, but I'm a hell of a lot more than that too. That is not the only thing I am.
Yeah, and for me, actually, in the beginning, I didn't mind saying it because I felt like I needed to sort of beat it in my brain.
Yes.
By the time I found WFS, which was like 8 months into it, I didn't like it anymore for the same reasons that you said. I felt like I was saying it like it was the most important part of me, and it wasn't. And it felt disempowering. I didn't like it anymore. And I always use that as an example that what helps us at one point in our recovery may not be helpful later. And so our needs can change, our perspective can change. And the other thing I was going to mention when you're talking about that is that when I took control of my recovery, which I had to do because they were telling me to do one thing that I couldn't, what actually ended up happening is I was learning how to guide myself in all areas of my life. because I was listening and I was reading and I was thinking and I was analyzing, and then I was setting goals and building plans and carrying them out. Well, that's how you handle all areas of your life, not just your sobriety, right?
It is. It is.
My competence to make professional decisions, and how am I going to build, get my relationship back on track, or how am I going to handle my PTSD, or how am I going to handle whatever issue comes up in life, my money. I mean, those same techniques actually applied to everything. And so it turned out in the long run, it helped me to build up those strengths and those competencies.
How did group support help you get there? Because a lot of what you just defined are something, a lot of self-discovery, but that self-discovery really does happen in a corporate environment, does it not? Where you're interacting with other people, learning from them, from what they're working on and the feedback they give you. Don't you think there's a community that's really critical in sobriety?
Well, I mean, there's definitely a notable percentage of people that get sober and stay sober without peer support, but for most of us, yes. But for most of us, we do find value there, and I found value there. For one thing, when I got home from rehab, I went to like 5 meetings a week because I wanted to have something to do in the evening, right? I mean, part of it is just to be going to a place where your sobriety is secure, but it was also about listening. What ideas am I hearing? What technique did somebody use that might be a good idea for me? But also the examples that people that were as bad off in their substance use as I was for as long as I was, and some of them were, now they were succeeding. And so there's a hope that you can get in a meeting, if other people have been able to do it, then maybe you can do it too. So I did find value in the groups, but once I got home from rehab, I emphasize this is 1994 and there was no Google, okay? So I went to the library to look for options. And
you may have to describe what a library is.
Yeah, I know. I went to the library. I actually had to call 800 numbers and send checks to P.O. boxes to get the books, but I found several other programs, and I went to them, and I incorporated their ideas. And today there's, you can do the internet. Today, if I were looking for alternatives to 12 steps, or, by the way, you can do both. You don't have to pick one. For example, in LifeRing, we don't require an exclusive agreement. A lot of our members also do 12 steps, and we support that if they think that's the best plan for them. But today you could go online, and the bigger secular options that you might look at are LifeRing, Secular Recovery, Smart Recovery, She Recovers, Women for Sobriety, and Recovery Dharma. Those are some of the larger ones. And they have different philosophies and different meeting formats. And so, it's good to look at them, try out a couple meetings for each one, and see where you feel most comfortable, where you feel like you're going to get the best bang for the buck. But also, you can add into it later. We actually get a lot of 12-step members in LifeRing when they've got about 2 or 3 years sober, and they're just looking for some new ideas and for some new ways of thinking, and they add LifeRing into their plan, into their approach.
I think that's very helpful. You know what I'm noticing from our discussion is that so often in recovery groups or new groups, anytime there's a group that you join, as you're joining any kind of group, like even a church, you're joining we do really, really, really well. When we do well, we do very well at the introductory steps. What do you get in? How do you pass your first test? How do you get through your first year, your first 2 years, your first 3 years? But there is little in my mind written. Now, I've not read a whole lot on recovery, I must admit, but there doesn't seem to be any room for evolution, any room for now you're at this phase, you're at a new phase, and so let's start talking about it in a whole new language and a whole new context. But I think this evolution in our recovery process really needs to be emphasized. Would you agree?
Yeah, and in LifeRing we actually talk about that. In our workbook, at the end of each section, there's a spot for your 6-month revisiting it, your update. And that's just the reminder that your recovery plan should be evolving over time. And part of the reason is that hopefully you've achieved some of your initial goals, right? And so now you can start attacking new goals. I mean, that alone should cause your plan to change. But it also can be that sometimes I know when we try to carry out a plan, sometimes we realize we set a goal and it wasn't actually a good goal for us, or it's not as high a priority as we thought, or new circumstances arise. So recovery should be evolutionary. If you're in the same place at 3 years as you were at 6 months, then to me, you might want to think about that, because it should be an evolutionary process that moves with time. And the other thing I'll say is a lot of people like the structure of 12 steps. In the beginning, they find that really useful, but once they get the ground underneath them, they don't need the structure as much as they did early on, and they're interested in looking at other approaches. That's part of what can happen.
Yeah, you know what I find to the people that are still involved in AA is they have formed their own club. That's all they hang together. Their friends are all sober people, and so it's almost as if they're divorcing themselves from life. That they, it's almost, Mary Beth, it's almost like a fear-based. That I'm afraid if I get out there in the middle of it, I'm going to fall into it again, so I'm not going to get out there in the middle of it. And I live quite the opposite. I live right out there in the middle of it, because I want to be involved in life in the fullest. And there's just is not enough on that. I love that you guys have that part of your program.
Well, the other thing I'll say is that sometimes in 12 steps there's this idea that you have to hyper-focus on your sobriety for the rest of your life, which isn't true for most people. And I reassure newcomers, no, it's the first 1 to 3 years. That's where it requires your concentrated attention. For most of us, after that, it doesn't need that kind of focus. That to me is a positive. That's a light at the end of that hard tunnel of your early recovery, which is a tough process. And so that's part of it. For most people, they are able to stop going to meetings or radically reduce the number of meetings and branch out into doing other things. The other thing I will say to your point about people being in 12 steps, I know part of the reason some people hang around is to be of service, and that is to be commended. Some people are there in the long haul to give back to the community, and that has value. And that's what I know, I try to do as well, is to be able to be of service to my community.
Well, you obviously are. I want to close this out with just a couple of questions, and you talk about, and I hope I interpreted this correctly in your writing, you talk about creating your own sort of robust recovery program. Explain to me what you mean by that. How can someone that's serious about trying to find recovery and are at that downside, have hit rock bottom, do you have sort of like a broad scope process, or is it just strictly individual?
I mean, I will say that LifeRing's workbook, which helps people think through their recovery plan, we actually sell a lot of our workbooks to recovery coaches who aren't LifeRing focused, because it's a really good tool to do the analysis. But for me, it was really about what I did, because, of course, that book didn't exist. But what I did was I really thought about what are the areas of my life that are broken. And there was a long list, okay? But then I really thought, what are my first priorities? Because I knew I could not fix all of those things at once. Like, it was impossible for me to split my attention that broadly. And so I really thought about what are my top priorities. Like, my top priorities were rebuilding my relationship with my partner, because he was ready to throw me out, getting my finances under control because I had a lot of debt, rebuilding myself professionally, and also focusing on my sobriety, and also starting to deal with my trauma. So that was like my initial list, because I couldn't go beyond that. That was more than enough for me to handle. And then it was really, okay, what are my goals, my first goals all those areas, and what's my plan to meet those first goals. And then once I meet the first goals, there's a new plan to go to the next goal, and on and on. It's sort of incremental and builds up that way. So that's how I thought about it.
Love it. And sort of what you did in the beginning is what AA will call taking an inventory of who we are, what we're all about, what we're feeling, and trying to understand our deepest selves.
Yeah, and also just looking at the practical things that I had to work on, because there were a lot. But so it was both like the sort of the practical, like, paying down debt, combined with the deeper work of relationship and my trauma recovery and my getting my sobriety solid.
So good, so good. Let me close with this question that is asked so many times, and there's rarely helpful answers to the question, so I'm putting you on the spot. Is there anything family and friends can do to help the addict?
I mean, we know now that people who are in recovery who have loving relationships with friends and family, the data shows that they do better on average. And so it is important to try to keep the loving bond, together, that you still love them no matter how bad things are. You'll be there when they're ready to get help. But one of the things I when I talk to friends and family about, I think part of it is really learning patience, because I think friends and family somehow have unrealistic expectations about the recovery process. Like, for example, perfect abstinence from day one, which happens, but it's rare. Most people don't have that, or they want to control the process. They think that their family member with a substance use disorder needs inpatient treatment, but the person doesn't think so. I don't think so. My family thinks so. I need to be in control of the process. I need to be the decision maker. They should be following and supporting in a loving way. I mean, so that's sort of the general overview of how I would think about it for friends and family.
Yeah, it is so difficult for friends and family to witness this, and with someone they love, and to see somebody being so self-destructive, that the temptation is to either come in as, well, both are savior, but one is saving through kindness, and the other is saving through the so-called tough love. Well, you're out of the house, you're on your own, you're this, and none of those answers are satisfactory to me. I think it is just, you can't just use those broad scope. Those are all so individually oriented, depending on the state of the person that you're talking to. And so it requires, I agree with you, it requires love and compassion, and then it requires just a heavy dose of wisdom, which one must, in my tradition, contemplate and meditate on and think about, and those are aspects that are absolutely critical.
Well, the other thing I'll say is that there are actually now alternatives for friends and family beyond just Al-Anon as well. And so friends and family have more choices for their support groups than they used to. LifeRing offers friends and family meetings, SMART does, Hazelden does, and there are others. And so friends and family can find support that can be helpful to talk to their peers. And I will also say, I'm friends and family too, right? I mean, I have friends and family. I've watched them go down deep in their addiction and not do what I wanted them to do in the time frame I wanted them to do it. So I do understand. But there are actually multiple support options for friends and family as well at this point.
You know what? After we close the show, I'm going to give you my email, and I would love for you to email me some of the key resources so I could put them in the show notes. Sure. I know I definitely want this LifeRing workbook. I may want that for myself just to play through it. It sounds very interesting. So I'm going to want to get those and offer those as resources to our listeners. And so let me close by saying, Mary Beth O'Connor, you really are so cool and so informed and so impressive. Thank you so much for being on the show. I truly appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me, and hopefully in the show notes you'll have my book as well, From Junkie to Judge, One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction.
Yes, and I've got that. That's the first thing I have on my links is a link to your book. That's the.
Thank you very much. I will say, too, that 30% of my book is actually about recovery, about how I did it the individualized way. So if any listeners are interested in that, I actually go into it in a lot of detail.
Oh, good. Yeah, this is such an important topic. Thank you once again.
Thanks for having me. I really have enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise. I also want to thank our listeners for tuning into the next chapter with Charlie. And until next, this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.